This also has intense mommy issues, so I didn't think I would be reading 2 books back to back like that, but here I am. Hello, my name is Wendy and I'm going to be doing my June wrap-up. I just wanted to leave a quick shout out for everyone who left a sweet comment or a message to me on my previous first booktube newbie tag video. I really appreciate it as someone who's very nervous stumbling into this community. Thank you for that. But yes, let's get into the books I read in June. So the first book I read in June was Milkfed by Melissa Broder. Milkfed follows Rachel, a 20-something lapsed Jewish woman who's working at an LA talent agency. She spends most of her life counting her calories and obsessively punishing herself at the gym. She gets these kind of habits because of her mother's strict upbringing and kind of forcing her to truly accept her childhood in a healthy way. Rachel has a therapist that tells her to go on a 90-day detox from her mother. So no texting, no phone calls, no interactions of any kind. And it's during this detox that she meets Miriam. Miriam is a plus-size woman who works at Rachel's go-to froyo shop. And Miriam is the exact opposite of Rachel. She loves her body, she believes in her faith very strongly, and she loves herself. And it's because of these traits that Rachel becomes absolutely obsessed with Miriam. She wants everything to do with her. She fantasizes about her in some of the most explicitly unique situations I've ever read. You guys, I think Melissa Broder is becoming one of my favorite authors. I think there's just something about how she writes women so raw and real that gets me so attached to the characters no matter how awful they are. And Rachel is awful. Rachel is a woman who doesn't really understand what she wants and at the same time judges everyone else. Rachel's also someone that doesn't really get faith, but she's willing to open that door as long as it's involving Miriam because she's so obsessed with her. Rachel's struggling with this idea of a perfect normal body at the same time wanting to get close to an obese woman who works at a froyo shop. So these are kind of like her conflicting areas of interest. She loves the fact that she can control her body's coping mechanisms, but at the same time loves the thought of being next to Miriam, but knows the only way she can do that is if she goes to the froyo shop and purchases something. Her strained relationship with her mom also makes it really difficult for her to not fall in love with people who have maternal-like qualities. So for example, women who are aged with mature bodies or kind women with naturally large bodies. I love that this explored female sexuality in such a loud and bizarre way because I think that sapphic books have this tendency to be a lot softer, a lot more angelic and nervous when it comes to sexual situations. It's a very romanticized and maybe fade to black situations in most sapphic books that I've read. If anything, it is very, very romantic. And in Milkfed, the sex scenes are so graphic and raw and maybe a little bit like in your face in how graphic that they are, that it was really just how I pictured two girls discovering each other's bodies truly. There was no filter, there was no angelic glow or anything like that. It was just two women getting it on and truly exploring each other's bodies. So I thought that was really refreshing to read because I don't think we get to read that a lot in sapphic books. I think the main issue I had with Milkfed is one that I see a lot of other reviewers have. It's the fact that Rachel is obsessed with Miriam, obviously, which in itself is unhealthy. But it's also maybe fetishization of Miriam's body, and maybe that's not the way to go when you're writing this kind of novel. There's a scene where she says when she first comes across Miriam's body and she's taking it all in, like the curves of her body and how the dress isn't doing her any favors, but at the same time she talks about how she would love to see Miriam play basketball, which is off the wall in terms of compliments and fantasies, but that's not even the half of it in terms of what's going on in her brain. You really kind of wonder if Rachel's desire is triggered by Miriam or just a fat body. Or even more so, is it triggered by the fact that this is a body she was never allowed to have? Also, the ending was kind of out of nowhere. There was a lot of unanswered questions and no closure for me. I guess I kind of understand why she went that route, but was still not the one I wanted. That being said, I still loved Milkfed. I loved it just as much as the Pisces. If anything, I think Rachel's character came out a little bit stronger in this one, just because you really get to see her thought process and her contemplate her desires, in not just sexually, but maybe even career-wise, her relationships with her mom, and her general relationship to herself. This book is not for everyone. This book is for very few people. I will say that. Melissa Broder writes in a way that is very blunt and dark and sexual and kind of crude that I think a lot of people would not enjoy, but I really enjoy this writing because I feel it's really refreshing. And I think that Rachel's character is someone that I know in a lot of women. In some parts of her, I kind of see myself. And so I think that's why I enjoyed the novel so much. So I gave it 4 stars. I think it's a really interesting read if you wanted to take the risk and try something weird for once. The next book I read was You Exist Too Much by Zania Arifat. This also has intense mommy issues, so I didn't think I would be reading 2 books back to back like that, but here I am. So this is a story about a Palestinian bisexual woman that's split into 2 parts. So first we have her several relationships that she's had in her life that she's kind of ruined herself and her love addiction. And then we have the sections about her and her strained relationship with her mother. Her mother is very conservative, an immigrant who kind of like goes back and forth between New York and the Middle East. And the novel goes through a lot of time skips throughout her life. You kind of go from places between her childhood in the Middle East to her more recent time in the rehabilitation center that she is in for her love addiction. The narrator, who goes unnamed throughout the novel, is very unlikable. She's my kind of character. She's very cold and distant to people who want to get close to her, and she also falls for people who she shouldn't fall for. For example, teacher-student scenarios or having various flings with people that she doesn't know, all while in a serious relationship. The narrator finds out that this pattern of romantic obsessions that she has is something known as love addiction, and so she signs up for this rehabilitation center in the Midwest. It becomes clear that the narrator is very self-destructive of her love life because of the lack of attention and affection she received as a child, especially from her mother. She feels the need to overcompensate for those lost mother-daughter moments through sexual and maybe romantic relationships. Where this novel kind of faltered for me was the amount of time jumps. We would go from talking about her Middle Eastern childhood and then jumping to a scene where she was a DJ having a fling with someone, go back to the rehab center where she was kind of figuring things out, and then she would write a really poetic piece about her mother. It was a lot to follow, especially if you were listening to the audiobook. I would be driving in the car listening to this audiobook, and we would go from Lebanon to the Midwest to her thoughts in like the span of 5 minutes. It was a lot. It was a lot to take in. I think that if she had just written one story, whether it be about her toxic relationships, the relationships with her mom, the rehabilitation center, I think that those would have been great by themselves. Putting them together and combining them into this fictional memoir was kind of a lot to take in. That being said, I still really enjoyed the narrator's character. I think that I tend to love characters, especially women, who are kind of in their heads and not really sure what to do with themselves. The narrator is a DJ, but then she goes back and forth between a writing program. I never really got to understand her love of music or writing. It was kind of like an afterthought, and I wanted to know that side of her artistic side, and we never really got that. We kind of just focused on her relationships, which was good, but I wanted to know the character herself a little bit better. I loved getting to see her thought process when it came to her repressed sexuality and how she felt about it concerning her mother, concerning her future. She talks about always picturing herself getting married, but never to a woman, and yet constant affairs that she has are with women, and she can't help but be overly attached to these women as opposed to the male characters. There was also some great commentary on the political climate in the Middle East that I was really entranced by. I loved getting to read those sections of Lebanon or Jordan or Palestine where she was making comments about the border or how people reacted differently than they did 10 or 20 years ago. Those are really refreshing to read. I gave this book 3.5 stars. I think Zania definitely has a gift for writing. I would just like it more if she didn't maybe time skip as much as she did, and maybe she focused a little bit on more of just a single topic than kind of all these medium-sized topics together. I think one big topic would have been really strong for her, but still a really good read and some great bisexual representation. I will say that some people think that this novel kind of puts bisexuality in a negative light because they think that the love addiction term is kind of problematic. I, for example, am a bisexual woman and I don't see that, but I can totally see how someone could interpret it that way. Just want to let that out there for maybe fellow bisexual or pan or queer readers that fear that this kind of term would be problematic in some way. I have to take a little break in between because it is hot. Today's sparkling water is a Kirkland brand strawberry. Delicious. The next book I read was Becoming a Man by P. Carl. Trigger warnings for suicide mentions and child as well as spousal abuse. This is a small nonfiction memoir about a man named Carl and his transition at age 50 from female to male. Carl's late transition in life has everyone asking, including himself, why bother making such a huge transition in your life at the so-called end of it? That transition brings a lot of other issues into his life as well. Carl was a butch lesbian for 30 plus years and is married to a woman named Lynette, who is also a lesbian. Because he is transitioning from female to male, it makes their relationship difficult for Lynette to process. It almost seems as though, in Lynette's eyes, Carl is making this transition more about himself than it is about their relationship. Carl also talks about how trans and queer labels don't really fit with him anymore. As a person who's already seen himself as a man his whole life and never acted or felt like a woman, trans doesn't really feel right to use. He also doesn't think that queer is a term he can use because he sees himself as a straight man married to a lesbian woman. So while Lynette herself might be queer, Carl himself doesn't see himself as such. There's a lot of great talk about the switch from a queer identity and a trans identity into the straight, white, and privileged one. Unfortunately, like many other parents of queer youth, Carl's parents are not accepting of his identity. They are also dealing with issues of their own. Carl's father is a deadbeat, alcoholic, abusive man, and Carl's mother is kind of this meek mother figure who kind of lets her husband do whatever she wants, at the same time trying to keep food on the table. There is talk of poverty, of having to go day to day thinking if you were going to get your next meal and at the same time struggling with issues of identity. We see Carl grow up and try to distance himself from the girl people perceived him to be through spaghetti westerns, athletics, and even just general mannerisms. And even though Carl does find a place within the queer community growing up and even the art scene, he still contemplates suicide day to day because he's living in the wrong body. Later on in the memoir, Carl explains that he knows this transition makes him public enemy number one. He is now a straight white male. He briefly talks about the toxic masculinity that comes with being a white male. Specifically, he talks about how shop talk and locker room talk is something that he falls victim to. And victim to might be the wrong word. He definitely participates in it from time to time, and he understands that that's wrong. But at the same time, he talks about how it's kind of riveting to know that that talk comes so easily to him because he's always been a man. However, I think that's where the book kind of left me a little upset. I think that would have made it a 5-star read for me. Coming to terms with toxic masculinity and talking about it in the queer sense from a queer perspective. I think that when we talk about toxic masculinity, we do talk about straight men. We do talk about straight white men specifically. I think if Carl had explained it from someone who transitioned and as someone who is married to a lesbian woman for 30 plus years, I think that we would have gotten a really good perspective on it. But he kind of just brushed it under the rug, admitted to feeling bad about it, and didn't really mention it after that. This was a really empowering and enlightening read though. I don't really read a lot of trans nonfiction books, and this one was just really stellar in both the way he describes his childhood, the way he describes the trans experience, and kind of shifting to this new idea. You don't really get to see trans people's stories well into their 50s. I believe most of the trans stories that I've read are people in their 20s and 30s transitioning. To do it so late as 50, it is really interesting to read a person's thought process during that time in their life. The audiobook is really good too. Carl himself reads it. There's a lot of emotion that he puts behind every word. So I give this book 4 stars. I just wanted him to talk about toxic masculinity more and how maybe he needs to grow up from that and maybe distance himself from it. Everything else, great. The prose, the story, the experience, the emotions, awesome. Definitely recommend. The next book I read was Where We Go From Here by Lucas Rocha, translated by Larissa Helena. Trigger warnings for homophobia, outing, as well as a really harsh stigma against HIV. This is a wonderful YA novel about 3 gay young men and how their lives change because of HIV. So first you have Vitor, who has just received a negative HIV test back, and how he's upset with the person who told him about his HIV status. You have Henrique, who was the person who slept with Vitor and has been very cautious and safe with his diagnosis, but at the same time falls for Vitor. And their relationship is really difficult. Vitor is interested in Henrique, but at the same time is very scared of HIV and unfortunately believes a lot of the misinformation and stigma that comes with that particular disease. Henrique, however, is sick of being treated as if he's just his diagnosis. And so you really get to see the difficulties and trauma that often come with these kinds of relationships. Finally, you have Ian. Ian has just received his positive test back, something he's been dreading for a couple weeks now. Ian has to navigate his life with HIV now, and he comes to terms with the fact that his life will never be the same. This book was a surprising fun romp. When I read YA, I'm not expecting to be impressed, just because I really try to love YA, but I feel like some of the dialogue gets so lost upon me. Like they'll talk about TikTok or they'll talk about Tumblr, and I feel like it's an adult trying to write as a teenager or something, and it just gets a little weird. But this one was really fun. There was a lot of great discussion surrounding HIV among the queer community, because the book talks about how even today it's still described as a queer disease or a gay disease. In the story, you see how young gay men are treated vastly differently when they're diagnosed with HIV, and how they're kind of outcasted by even queer communities. Also, this book could have come off as preachy, and it didn't. It came off really genuine, really wanted to show the reader that it wasn't so technical in its explanations of, you know, medication or anything. It was kind of just like a conversation starter when it comes to kind of bringing up the subject of HIV, not just among men, but among women and among friends. It was really, really good in that sense. The reason why it didn't hit 5 stars for me was that it was kind of simply written, and some of the references were kind of a hit or miss for me. I remember, again, when an author tries to name drop a popular artist or movie or social media app, it gets a little too, not cringy, but I feel like the author tries to use it as a crutch to relate to the reader, which I didn't really need. But again, I'm not the YA demographic anymore. I'm almost 30, so that could have just been on me. Also, again, yes, the prose wasn't all the way there for me. A little too simply written for my taste, but other than that, a wonderful read. Great topic of discussion, wonderful characters. You've got gay representation, Brazilian representation, drag queens who are awesome, and the audiobook is phenomenal. Great cast. Super, super fun read. So I gave it 4 stars. I think it surprised me completely. So if you wanted to read a queer YA novel, please check this one out. The final novel I read was On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This one has the most trigger warnings. Drug abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, PTSD, and a very graphic animal abuse description. So please keep that in mind. This book is beautifully written, but oh my god, every trigger warning you could think of is in here. I had thought this book was a memoir, and only 40 pages in, after several Google searches and YouTube interviews, did I realize that this was just a fiction novel about a gay young Vietnamese man writing letters to his illiterate mother. And because Ocean Vuong is also a gay Vietnamese man with a mother who immigrated to the United States, I thought that this little dog character, which is the main character of the story, was him. But apparently no, that's just a coincidence. There is some talk about maybe his life experiences being inspiring for this novel, but mostly this was just Ocean Vuong's way of saying, can language truly be a bridge for people? Something that people can connect to through a shared practice. So this novel is about Little Dog, a gay young Vietnamese man, and he's writing letters to his mother. And the letters consist of a lot of things. They talk about his relationship with her, how it's strained because of her PTSD, how he is trying to navigate the immigrant experience through her eyes, and at the same time, what he went through when he was growing up with her. The relationship is not perfect because war affected her so severely. Little Dog's mother is very much a victim of trauma. And so having a child through that trauma will definitely affect her parenting. The other main section besides the relationship with his mother is the relationship he has with Trevor, a white boy he met while working the tobacco fields. The novel was an emotional ride in terms of topics and discussions. I think it had some great talk about queerness and being POC and kind of having to describe your queerness to your immigrant mother who is suffering from her own trauma, and for a child to kind of come out and say and explain their queerness is really difficult. The sections on Vietnam were so graphic and yet so hauntingly beautiful that I wanted to stay there. I wanted to know what hurt Rose, which is Little Dog's mother. I wanted to know what hurt his grandmother, who's also a big character in the novel. The relationship between these three characters is really explored through the flashbacks in Vietnam. Little Dog is such a fascinating character. He's really someone you don't want to let go of, and you really don't know how to feel about either. So some of the prose worked out really well, like those scenes I mentioned, and then some of the prose was just a little too experimental for me. The letters, I think, were a weird kind of choice, or if not weird, maybe the wrong choice. Some of the letters made sense. They talked about the relationship together, the immigrant experience, but some sections of the letters he was talking about the sexual awakening he had with this boy named Trevor, which I mean was obviously very important and crucial to his life, but I don't know why you would include that to a letter to your illiterate mother. I just want to know what Ocean Vuong was thinking when writing this character and the sexual scenes in these letters, so I don't know. I just thought that was kind of weird to include to a letter to your mom, but maybe that's just me. Also, one of the references was visited twice pretty significantly in the novel, and it is the song by 50 Cent called Many Men. And as someone who remembers that song being burned onto CDs in the 2000s, it's just weird to associate 50 Cent's Many Men with a gay Vietnamese awakening novel that has to do with the Vietnam War. It just didn't make sense to me. I understand that maybe it has to do with toxic masculinity. Many Men is a song by 50 Cent that talks about how many men wish death upon 50 Cent. He had written this song after being shot and surviving, and I understand why a lot of the rap genre maybe kind of overexerts their male qualities to prove their strengths, but it was still weird to kind of put this beautiful novel next to the album picture of 50 Cent. I don't know, it was a little jarring for me. All that to say, I really enjoyed the novel. I just wanted more from Little Dog, or better yet, from Ocean. I think this would have been a stellar memoir. Alex from What Page Are You On? I was watching his review, and he said how this would have been a much better memoir because he doesn't really know who it's for, and I have to agree. I don't know who this novel would be for because it is fiction. And it does talk about queerness and the POC experience and having an immigrant mother. It's really kind of all over the place in terms of an audience, but at the same time, because it's fiction, you wonder who it's meant for, you know? I totally understand why this book got so many 5-star reviews from several other booktubers. I think that some of the prose is really beautiful. There's a specific scene where his mother, who works at a nail salon, helps out this woman who is disabled. And it is one of the most beautiful scenes I'd ever read, and I still go back to it. But yeah, I think that I would definitely read something else by Ocean Vuong. I gave this book 3.5 stars. I think that if it just had chosen a certain formatting that was a little bit better, or if it was just a memoir, I think it could have been easily 4 to 5 stars. But yeah, it was just a lot going on and not enough explanation for me, but again, maybe not the book meant for me. So still a really good read. I definitely recommend it. On to the manga I read this past month. I read The Fist of the North Star by Tetsuo Hara. This is the shonen manga of shonen mangas. This manga is considered the influence for many of the shonen manga that I read today. So that includes JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, which is one of my favorite mangas of all time. So I wanted to see what the hype was about, and oh my god. They did not, and by they I mean Tetsuo Hara and Buronson, I believe is his name, the writer. They did not disappoint. So this is a story about Kenshiro, and Kenshiro lives in a post-apocalyptic world where there is so much crime and violence and danger. There's not a lot of resources. People are kind of living in fear. And the main character, Kenshiro, he is someone that is skilled in the martial arts known as Hokuto Shinken, which allows him to strike his opponents with these deadly kind of, I guess, touches where they affect their vital points, and it makes his opponents kind of die in these gory and explicit ways. The art is so classic. I love beefy characters like this who have ridiculous proportions, who show their muscles in pretty much every kind of chapter. It's just kind of my thing. I don't normally rate manga until I'm done with it, so I have the first hardback edition here. The first novel, I believe, captures a few of the chapters, so when the second one comes out, you better believe I'm gonna read it. I also read Go For It, Nakamura by Syundei. I think that's how you say it. I'm really sorry if I have not pronounced anybody's name correctly. I should have said that at the beginning. Go For It, Nakamura is about this closeted teenage boy who falls in love with his handsome and popular classmate. The story follows Nakamura, who is, again, closeted and doesn't have very many friends. He's not very social, but he falls for Hirose, who is, of course, popular, attractive, kind, loyal. And so you kind of just go through several little scenes that are kind of interconnected, but not really, where he's trying to get Hirose's attention, trying to become his friend, and then maybe more. It was a really sweet novel. I think that it was definitely overhyped. I see a lot of talk around this particular manga, and I thought it was pretty good, but definitely not super life-changing in the way that some people talk about it. I think the art is really cute, and I think the story is really sweet, and I just realized that there is a sequel coming out, so I will be reading the sequel, so we'll see. And that was it. That was all I read for June. I think I did pretty good this past month. I'm trying to read as much as I can because I go back to school in August. I didn't take summer school, so I'm just waiting for the fall semester to start up. Once fall kicks back in, oh god, I will not have time for reading at all. I'd love to know if you guys read any of these books or what you are reading this past month that you really enjoyed. I also want to know if where you're at, it's super hot as it is over here. I'm complaining, I know, because I live in California and 110 is about where it gets for us, which is like hotter than hell. But I know that we don't have humidity like some places, so let me know if where you're at it's really hot or if it's really cold or you don't know what's going on. But yeah, I appreciate you guys coming back, and if it's your first time here, I hope you come again and see me. I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!